Ravishing Rick Rude was one of the most unforgettable heels in wrestling history. With his incredible charisma and ability to stir up any crowd, Rude was expected to one day become world champion. But beneath that arrogant, cocky persona was a man who was burdened by injuries, personal struggles, and the darker side of the wrestling business. Richard Erwin Rude was born in 1958 in St. Peter, Minnesota, a town that produced a number of future wrestling superstars. At high school, Rick was part of a group that included Kurt Hennig, Barry Darsow, Tom Zenk, and Nikita Koloff. Before stepping into the ring, Rude worked as a bouncer and tried his hand at bodybuilding and arm wrestling, even competing in the 1983 World Arm Wrestling Championships, where he came a respectable 6th place. Rude soon caught the eye of Eddie Sharkey, a former wrestler who had already trained stars like the Road Warriors and Bob Backlund. Sharkey had noticed that Rude wasn't just built like a pro wrestler, but he also carried himself with the confidence of one. Rick made his debut in the NWA's All-Star Wrestling promotion as Ricky Rude, a clean-cut babyface. He paid his dues, losing to the territory's biggest stars, and soon he was getting noticed on the circuit. He wrestled all around the country, but it quickly became clear that being a bland babyface wasn't getting him over with the fans. By 1984, Rick was ready to reinvent himself, and the opportunity came when he headed to Memphis. It was in the Continental Wrestling Association that Rick debuted what would become his signature gimmick. He dressed in flashy robes and he dripped with self-confidence, declaring himself to be God's gift to wrestling and to women. The fans hated him. Well, the male fans certainly did, but Rude's mix of technical ability and athleticism made him a unique villain. His momentum carried him to championship wrestling from Florida, where he captured his first major singles title, the NWA Florida Southern Heavyweight Championship. He began to establish himself as a main event player, feuding with territory superstars like Wahoo McDaniel and Billy Jack Haynes. He then made his way to World Class Championship Wrestling, where he held the NWA American Heavyweight Championship. By the end of 1986, Rick had built a reputation across the wrestling territories. His ability to rile up the crowd made him a natural fit for Jim Crockett Promotions, one of the biggest players in the NWA. This was Rick's first step onto a bigger stage, and he didn't waste the opportunity. He teamed up with Manny Fernandez, forming a tag team called the Awesome Twosome. The men quickly became one of the most hated acts in the promotion. Together they were a unique combination, and they quickly became the NWA Tag Team Champions. But backstage, things weren't going so well. Rick found out that he was getting paid far less than his tag team partner Manny. He fell out with management about this when they wouldn't match his pay, and so he stormed out of the promotion while still a tag team champion, and he never came back. He made his WWF debut in 1987, and this was the beginning of the most iconic chapter of his career. Rude was introduced as the latest member of Bobby Heenan's infamous Heenan family, and here the ravishing persona exploded into something larger than life. Every time he entered the ring, it was like an event in itself. Rude strolled to the ring like a man who knew that he was better than every other man in the building. He'd grab the microphone, calling the men in the crowd fat, out-of-shape sweat hogs, before taking off his robe and gyrating his hips towards the women, which naturally pissed off the men in the audience. And Rick was so believable at playing the character, but in reality he was devoted to his wife and never removed his wedding ring. Instead, he covered it up with a piece of tape while he was performing. Even his custom airbrushed tights became a part of his persona, and of course his in-ring work just got better and better. The WWF wove his womanizing character into one of his first major storylines against Jake the Snake Roberts. This was the feud that cemented him as a top heel in the company, and he played out masterfully. It all started when Rude invited a lady into the ring, unaware that she was Jake's wife Cheryl. When Cheryl slapped him and revealed her identity, the crowd erupted, but Rude didn't back down. He next showed up with Cheryl airbrushed onto his tights, and that's when Jake decided that he'd had enough. Furiously, he stormed to the ring and tore the tights off, leaving Rude in his briefs. It was an iconic moment that all led to the 1988 Survivor Series, where Roberts finally got his revenge by pinning Rude. In 1989, Rude started a feud with the Ultimate Warrior. By this time it was clear that Warrior was very intense and unique, but he wasn't a very good wrestler. That's where Rick came in. He was tasked with making Warrior look like $1 million. Their feud began at the Royal Rumble with a pose-down competition. When the fans gave the win to Warrior, Rude attacked him with a metal workout bar. The feud escalated to WrestleMania 5, where Rude did what no one else could. He pinned the Warrior, winning the Intercontinental title with an assist from Bobby Heenan, of course. It was Warrior's first televised loss, and Rude solidified himself as a top heel. But the rivalry got personal backstage. WWF feuds at the time didn't just involve 1 or 2 matches on TV. The men would have to work with each other for weeks, night after night, on the house show circuit. Rude was a patient man, but after a while he got frustrated with Warrior's reckless and stiff in-ring style. And so Rude confronted Warrior backstage, demanding that he be more careful in their matches. When Warrior just brushed him off, Rude reportedly knocked him out with a single punch. Despite the backstage friction, the two continued their feud, culminating in a rematch at SummerSlam where Warrior reclaimed the IC title. Roddy Piper interfered, distracting Rude and giving Warrior the opening to secure the win. And that led to a feud between Rude and Piper, which included a memorable brawl in a steel cage match at Madison Square Garden. But as the 90s approached, Rude began to evolve. He got rid of the perm, he cut his hair short, and adopted a more rugged, no-nonsense look. These changes signalled a shift in his character as the WWF prepared to push him to the top of the card. He clashed with the Ultimate Warrior again in 1990, but this time the stakes were higher. Warrior was now the WWF Champion, and Rude was his #1 contender. And their showdown was set for SummerSlam 1990 in a steel cage. The Warrior ultimately retained his title when he escaped the cage, but Rude's performance proved that he could hang at the very top of the card. Rude transitioned into a new storyline with the Big Boss Man. This program was meant to keep Rude in a prominent position against one of the WWF's biggest babyfaces, but the feud was cut short. He had a massive falling out with Vince McMahon. Rude discovered that the WWF was still using his likeness to advertise house shows, despite him not being on the tour and therefore not being able to make any money. Adding fuel to the fire was an alleged demand from McMahon for Rude to increase his steroid use to enhance his physique even further. Rude declined, believing that he was already in good enough shape and he didn't need to increase his steroid intake. These disputes came to a head in late 1990 and he walked away from the WWF in October of that year at the height of his career. He tried to join the Universal Wrestling Federation in early 1991, but the WWF blocked it due to him still being under contract, so Rick spent a few months in Japan before coming home and signing for WCW. At Halloween Havoc, he was unveiled as the Masked Phantom and joined the Dangerous Alliance, quickly establishing himself as one of WCW's top heels. Shortly after his debut, Rude beat Sting to win the WCW United States title. His reign lasted a record-breaking 14 months, during which he elevated the championship with excellent matches against opponents like Ricky Steamboat and Dustin Rhodes. In 1993, WCW finally began positioning Rude as a true main eventer. He defeated Ric Flair to win the International World Heavyweight Championship. The prestige of this belt didn't quite match up to the World Heavyweight Championship, but he still carried the title with a great amount of pride. Sadly for Rude, tragedy was just around the corner. He suffered a serious neck and back injury when he landed on a metal ramp outside the ring during a match with Sting in Japan. The injury effectively ended his in-ring career. He collected an insurance payout for several years and he stayed away from the wrestling business entirely. However, in January 1997, he re-entered the business with a surprise debut in ECW. His only match in the company came at Heatwave, where he teamed up with Tommy Dreamer and the Sandman in a 6-man tag, only to betray them and side with Jerry Lawler in ECW's interpromotional feud with the WWF. This led to a return to the Federation, where he joined DX as the group's insurance policy. Though he couldn't wrestle, his presence brought a certain gravitas to the group. Just a few months after his return, Rude found himself in the middle of one of wrestling's most infamous moments, the Montreal Screwjob. Rude was furious at the betrayal of his friend Bret Hart, and as he was operating without a formal WWF contract, he decided that he was done with the company. In November 1997, Rude became the first wrestler to appear on WWF Raw, WCW Nitro and ECW programming all within the same week. On Nitro, which aired live, Rude cut a scathing promo on Vince McMahon, Shawn Michaels and DX. An hour later, and fans watching Raw saw Rude in a pre-taped episode, and later in the week he even appeared on a previously recorded episode of ECW Hardcore TV. In WCW, he became a part of the NWO, where he managed his old friend Curt Hennig. In March 1999, Rick parted ways with WCW to focus on training for a comeback, but sadly, it was a return to the ring that he'd never get to make. Rick Rude passed away at the age of 40 years old. The cause of death was an overdose, including painkillers and anabolic steroids. His death shocked the wrestling world because despite all of his success in the business, it felt like he still had so much more to give, and he died at such a young age. Even in his final days in WCW, Rick remained a figure of immense charisma, and he was respected and loved by his peers and the fans alike.